I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for the generous introduction. I have to say I heard Senator Franken's remarks and that he was here, and it reminded me of a recent incident. We had Senator Franken invited me to Minneapolis to speak about the problem of misclassification, and we invited him to our Wage and Hour Division office in Minneapolis, and the order of prayer was going to be the head of my office was going to introduce Senator Franken, and Senator Franken then wanted to introduce me as a guest to his state. And so the Wage and Hour director from our office there got up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Senator Al Franken." And he sat down. And I was sitting there sweating, thinking, oh my gosh, that's a heck of an introduction. So Senator Franken stood up and he looked at our district director and said, "Well, thank you for that warm and generous introduction." So I can really say that. I appreciate it. On behalf of Secretary Perez and our whole department, I want to, first of all, just express my gratitude for the dynamic leadership you have shown here at the Firefighters Union, and for all the work that you do. And despite the challenges that your union, like every union in this country, faces, you have been able to continually represent firefighters across this country so ably, and not only represent them, but grow that membership in what is clearly such a challenging environment. I'm also grateful to be on the stage with Secretary Treasurer Miller and your other leadership team, and I want to thank Kevin O'Connor for organizing my participation here today. And I also want to acknowledge it's also good to be up on the stage with several Harvard Trade Union Program graduates, and I know a number of you are probably also graduates of our program. I still call it our program because I've taught in it for about 23 years, and the firefighters have been one of our greatest supporters and have provided us an opportunity to work with your leadership in that program, which again I think speaks to how highly and how important you value both education and adapting to the changing environment that union leaders and union members face every day. And then finally, thank you all for the work that you do. Every one of us benefits from the protection and your willingness, and the members of your union's willingness to take the risks every day to protect all of us in our day-to-day life, and know so well the risks that you and your members face in providing that vital public service. I wanted to take this opportunity to be with you today to speak some about a different kind of protection that my agency is entrusted in undertaking, and that is protecting and ensuring that working people across this country receive a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. It's a very simple statement, but I think it is so fundamental about what our labor standards are all about, and why they, in my mind, provide a bedrock, particularly to all the working people across the country who don't benefit from a labor union who can protect them for those basic rights, who can be their voice at the workplace. And because of that, the mission of my organization, the Wage and Hour Division at the Department of Labor, as well as many of our programs at the Department of Labor generally, are so fundamental and so important to creating that foundation to protect working people across the country. The protections that the Fair Labor Standards Act and the many other acts that my agency enforces are really to provide a basic level of economic security for our nation's workers, and to allow them to earn enough wages to purchase the goods and services to support them, their families, and their communities. And that includes providing an income sufficient to support the vital public services like firefighting that are so essential to safe communities. But ensuring a fair day's pay means not just enforcement. It's not just about enforcement, but it's that making sure we keep up to date with what a fair day's pay for a fair day's work means. That's why Secretary Perez and all of us in the Department of Labor have worked so hard and will continue to work to support an increase in our federal minimum wage, a fight that will keep on for some time. More immediately, as the General President indicated, we've been working hard to update our overtime regulations so that they once again reflect the intent of the Fair Labor Standards Act of making sure that most people working in this country, if they work more than 40 hours, receive the overtime pay that they deserve. That's why in March of 2014, President Obama issued an executive order asking Secretary Perez to review our overtime laws and to make sure that they reflect the modern times we're in, that they provide the protection that the statute envisions, and to make them simpler to administer so all people know whether or not they are covered and that we can really make sure that the protections people deserve happen on the ground. Sadly, that's not the case. There are millions of salaried workers across this country that Congress intended to protect through the Fair Labor Standards Act that do not receive those protections anymore. A convenience store manager, for example, can be expected to work 50 or 60 hours a week, making barely enough to keep them out of poverty, maybe making $30,000 a year or less, and receive no protections for our overtime law. In preparing our work on this very vital piece of legislation, Secretary Perez and I met with a whole range of workers around the country. I always remember a worker we spoke with who, a salaried manager, a woman who was regularly working 70 hours a week. Secretary Perez asked her, "When's the last time you worked 40 hours in a week?" And she looked up and she said, "You know, I think the last time I worked 40 hours in a week was when I was on vacation." And I think that speaks to the kinds of challenges and the way that our overtime provisions have become so out of whack with the reality faced by so many working people. Since we issued our original, since the President's memorandum was issued and before we published our notice of public rulemaking, proposed rulemaking for the overtime provisions, we reached out to businesses, we reached out to state and local government, we reached out to worker advocates, unions, and to individual workers to get their best ideas and input on what it was going to take to update the so-called white-collar exemptions of the overtime laws. And following months and months of extensive consultations, really an unprecedented level of outreach to all of the different stakeholders affected by the overtime law, the department developed a proposal that will extend overtime protections to over 5 million workers who currently don't have them in its first year of implementation alone. Our department received more than 270,000 comments on the proposed rule, and we are, of course, carefully considering them all as we finalize the rule. As General President Schaitberger mentioned, it has gone to OMB for their review, and we hope to have this final rule in place in very soon. Now, at the department, we not only have tried to support overtime pay through updating regulations, but in the actions that we've taken, including supporting the rights to overtime pay for firefighters. For example, in 2011, when the city of New York tried to say that police sergeants were exempt from the overtime pay requirements given their limited management responsibilities, we stood up and said no. We filed a brief arguing that their primary duty was frontline law enforcement work in the field and that those sergeants were therefore entitled and deserved overtime pay. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals agreed and handed down a decision in Mullins v. New York to protect the fair wage and overtime rights of first responders, including firefighting personnel under the FLSA. Last year, in a more complicated case where the facts were in dispute, we argued in an amicus brief to the Fourth Circuit that a district court judge was wrong to rule against fire captains in Fairfax County, Virginia, who were seeking overtime payments rather than to let them present evidence at a trial, and we are currently waiting on a decision in that case. Not only through litigation, but our efforts are every day we work to ensure that overtime and the other provisions of our acts happen on a day-to-day basis through enforcement. We've continued to stand up for the rights of your members to fair pay by rebuilding the enforcement capacity at the Labor Department generally and in my agency in particular. From the beginning of this administration, President Obama has invested in our worker protection agencies so we can get back into the enforcement business, a business we were sadly out of for 8 years' time. We hired in my own agency 300 new investigators at the beginning of the administration, and we have fought with the support of the IAFF every year to secure at least our budget as it is and to fight for improvements in that budget so we can continue to hire the enforcement investigators we so need to do our work. We've also changed our game. We know that in any world, even in a world with more investigators, we have to use our resources strategically and so that we get concrete results from the application of those enforcement resources. So we think very hard about not only where we investigate, how we do our enforcement, but our approach to doing so. We work hard in communicating our message so employers understand that we're out there, we're serious about this, and that we are pushing hard to improve compliance. And we feel good that we've moved the dial a lot in that respect. In the last year, since 2009, we have collected a total of $1.6 billion in back wages for working people across this country. And that work and thinking strategically even last year allowed us to recover $250 million in back wages for about 240,000 workers affected. And we will continue that fight throughout my time in this agency. We've also increased our recovery for individual workers. You know, numbers like that are really big, but when you take it down to what does that mean for an individual workers, we're talking about average recoveries that represent 5 or 6 weeks of a food budget, more than a month's rent, real impact on the hardworking families that make up our country, and we feel very positive about that. Over the last several years, we've been targeting investigations where evidence shows that our labor law violations are greatest. There are too many industries in this country where the erosion of workplace standards happened over a decade and where their employers felt that it was fair game not to pay workers the minimum wage, not to pay workers what they earned in terms of overtime pay. We have challenged the issue of misclassification. Incorrectly calling workers independent contractors where they are really employees and deserve all the rights that employment should afford under our laws. And now we're trying to take that strategic enforcement to the next level because we know we'll never have enough investigators to go to every workplace. And instead, we're also trying to get our message out. We're trying to create what we call ripple effects that improve the compliance behavior of not only the employers we do investigate, but send the message to those we don't investigate that they also need to come to compliance and take our laws seriously. We are also doing really an unprecedented amount of outreach to different stakeholders. Me and members of my agency speak to business groups across this country to let them understand what their responsibilities are and where their responsibilities require guidance, require information and education. We're happy to do that, but we also want to spread the message about how serious we are. We've worked actively building ties with labor unions and worker advocates who are really the ground game to make sure that workers understand their rights and that will be willing to exercise those rights. We've actually created a new position in most of our local offices whose whole role is to do that outreach to unions, to do that outreach to business groups so that we really strengthen our impact and improve the compliance with our laws. But there's so much more to do, and our president has been so supportive of the work of enforcement agencies, which is why in the 2017 budget, the president has proposed further increases in the staff of my agency for 300 more investigators. So at the time of the end of this administration, we leave our wage and hour division and the other enforcement agencies in the Department of Labor that are so important, strengthened and ready to take on the challenges for the next decade. And we appreciate the support that the IAFF has always provided us in that important work. Under this administration, we've not only focused on enforcement, but we've also focused finally on making sure that the message of compliance is one that resonates across different communities and is strongly understood. And we know fully that by securing the salaries and wages of working people across the country, not only are they able to better support their families, they're better to able to support their communities and the vital kinds of services that are provided by those communities, first and foremost, the work done by firefighters across our country. We will continue to work with you specifically on the issues of importance to your own membership. We have had a wonderful working relationship with the IAFF leadership throughout the administration, and we look forward to continuing to working together to ensure that the FLSA is correctly applied to firefighters and to other emergency responders. So at the Wage and Hour Division, we want to continue to vigilantly make sure that our laws reflect and our regulation reflect this basic mission of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. We'll continue to stand up for firefighters overtime. We want to stand up for overtime for workers throughout the economy through the steps that I've described to ensure that more and more Americans get the fair pay and can pursue the middle-class economic security and lifestyle and are able to move up the ladders of opportunity in the future. We continue to look forward to working together with the men and women working across the country as firefighters so that the success of our enforcement isn't just the kind of statistics that I mentioned this morning that show improvements in back wages and compliance, but really so that working people in any workplace across the country can walk in and expect that they can receive the fair day's pay for a fair day's work that our statutes seek to ensure. I want to thank you again for inviting me to speak. I want to thank again the General President for his kind introduction, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the future.